Hello, welcome back. I'm joined by Andrew Ziemick. You may remember we had a chat around 8 months ago on manganese, and this is a follow-up session because there has been obviously a lot of macro events around the world that have been impacting the metals market recently. So we thought it'd be good for us to have a bit of a catch up and really understand what the manganese market, especially the high purity sulphate market, is looking like at the moment. So Andrew, good to have you back on.
Thank you.
Set the scene. What's happened since we last spoke?
Indeed. We last spoke in September, which is about 8 months ago, and a lot happened in the world in general, but in manganese market in particular. First and foremost, we had a 2021 results, which I'm happy to share with your viewers. So the production of manganese ore was slightly up, about 5% compared to 2021. But there was a significant decline in China, which is the largest market for this metal. They produced about 15% less than 2021. So no surprise that their import was very significant. China imported 5 times as much manganese ore as they produced themselves, which made them the biggest importer of manganese ore in the world, accounting for 74% of total global imports. And that's because they have a huge steel industry, and manganese mostly goes to steel. Then we had a price roller coaster, which surprised many, delighted a few, and dismayed many others. We had the price going up from about $2,000 per ton of metal, electrolytic manganese metal, as we call it, EMM, to something like close to $8,000 per ton in Europe, and in the United States to even $10,500. So very significant price rises. These price rises were mostly to do with the changes in the structure of the Chinese electrolytic manganese metal industry. And in January 2021, they set up a cooperation agreement, very quickly nicknamed the cartel by the market. Very unkind name, but probably not that far from the truth. And that triggered the chain of events, closing down of certain much smaller plants, production lines, mostly on environmental grounds, being too polluting, too inefficient, and so on. So consolidating the production in the hands of a handful of bigger companies. And I suppose on the way up, when the prices were rising and rising and rising, some people were accumulating stocks out of the fear that they may rise even further, and they did. So now they seem to be consuming those stocks, and prices have fallen. And that was also accelerated by the massive lockdowns we have in China now, lasting for now over 2 months. So those prices of the metal itself are down to about $2,300 in China, about $3,000 per ton in Europe. But I must say that not all prices of manganese product are moving in parallel. On the contrary, if we look at the manganese sulphate prices, particularly high purity manganese sulphate, which is used in lithium-ion batteries, these prices were holding steady when the metal prices were going up and down like a yo-yo. And sulfate prices were just going in one direction, up and up and up, to reach something close to 1,800 at some point per ton of manganese sulfate. You have to multiply by 3 to make it comparable with the metal, because the sulfate is only 32% manganese. So these prices held very well until the beginning of May. Now we saw some drop, which we attribute to the lockdowns, particularly in the Shanghai area, where a lot of the battery makers are located. And essentially the spot market came almost to a halt because of these lockdowns. So we'll watch this space with interest, but I believe the prices of the sulfates will continue to go up. They will recover from the temporary trough. The other prices are very much linked to the steel industry, so depending on what is your view on what's happening in the steel industry, that is where the prices are going to go.
Why don't we talk about the steel industry very quickly, because there's some political and global events that potentially might be pushing that side of the industry down, and then there are other potential outcomes that could push it up. So what's your view on that?
Yeah. When I was looking at the steel production forecast at the beginning of February, they were not very encouraging. Most of the analysts still saw production of steel growing, but very slowly. So like 1%, 1.5%, maybe 2% at max in this year, but then slowing down to 0.4, 0.3, 0.1. And China going just down and down and down, a slowdown in the economy of China, causing the steel production in this country going down. The war in the Ukraine has changed it all. And now we see a lot of factors pushing steel production up in the future. One major factor is the reconstruction of the Ukraine. The war will not last forever. The damage to the country is absolutely massive. It's difficult to imagine if you don't follow the news quickly how many railway lines, bridges, industrial plants and housing stock, how much is damaged, beyond repair. It just needs to be built from scratch. And we believe there will be a massive rebuilding effort in the Ukraine itself, very likely being supported financially by the West with a variety of packages. Some of them are already in the pipeline, others will no doubt come. And this, like any reconstruction of infrastructure, this is a very positive factor for steel demand. The second factor comes from oil and gas. I don't think any European country has any appetite for Russian oil and gas anymore, long term, even if the war is over and some sanctions may be lifted. So there is a big push in the oil and gas industry to find replacements for Russian oil and gas. And this translates into very much increased activity in oil and gas exploration, in building of liquid natural gas terminals. For example, in Germany, they had planned one terminal, and this couldn't get approved, and it was taking forever to approve. And now, all of a sudden, within a month, they approved 2 LNG terminals very quickly. So we'll see much more activity there. And the steel, which is used in oil and gas industry, very often this is the steel using a lot of manganese and molybdenum, and these 2 metals will benefit from that. And finally, that's maybe not something that I'm talking about lightly, but that's the fact of life. Rearmament. All those tanks lost in the battles of Ukraine, all those artillery pieces and so on, they will need to be replaced on both sides of the conflict. And beyond that, so we'll probably see a significant more spending on armaments within NATO, particularly if Finland and Sweden join, rearming the eastern flank, strengthening the eastern flank of the alliance. So that's again a big push towards steel consumption, and good news for all the alloys which go into steel production, and manganese being one of them. So we see a lot of factors pushing the steel production up, and probably those doom and gloom scenarios from the beginning of February about the steel production slowing down, they probably need to be rewritten. However, big question remains whether this is enough, all those factors pushing up, whether they are enough to counterbalance the slowdown of the economy of China, which is happening.
Any view on that at the moment, or is it too early? I guess it must also depend on timing, right? Because
indeed, whether the timing is a big unknown, because nobody knows, whether the war will end in 2 months or in 2 years.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on from steel, anyway. Obviously, the last time we spoke, we did discuss a lot about batteries, and I think that's where a lot of the excitement, especially from investors' perspective, is looking at this high purity sulphate manganese. Has there anything changed in terms of the battery market since we last spoke 8 months ago?
It has. I mean, general picture is still very bright for manganese, even brighter than it was before. But there are 2 main things I want to talk to you about. One is the milestone, which is the opening of the first Tesla factory in Europe, near Berlin, in Grüneheide. which happened in March. Elon Musk was there in person, and he made a very important speech there.
I think there's an interesting potential for manganese. And the important thing is, like, if you look at, at very large scale, you have to say, okay, we need tens of millions of tons. It's like maybe hundreds of millions of tons ultimately. And so the materials that are used for batteries at very large scale must be common materials. If they're not common materials, you can't scale. Well, graphene, I know everyone loves graphene, but it's, maybe we'll use it at some point, but graphene is a difficult thing to make, but even graphene is made of carbon. So, anyway, the fundamentals of scaling batteries are just say, like, how many millions of tons can be produced and produced in an ethical and environmentally good way. I'm confident that we can scale to global volumes using iron phosphate and manganese cathode, and then a nickel cathode for long range.
And in this speech, he again mentioned manganese. In fact, he stressed that using manganese in batteries is the main plank of the Tesla's strategy going forward. And his justification wasn't that much technical, like, he didn't try to elaborate how, what good manganese use does to the battery. But he simply stated that we cannot have a truly affordable batteries for electric vehicles without finding cheap materials. And cobalt and nickel, which are used predominantly in those batteries today, they are certainly not cheap.
Well, there's also political risk and geographical risk with those metals at the moment.
Indeed,
well,
indeed. Right? Just to remind our viewers that nearly 70% of cobalt these days comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not perceived as one of the most stable countries in the world. And its price is also very volatile. And manganese, my favorite subject, the cobalt is between 10 and 33 times more expensive than manganese. So there's a lot of rationale to use manganese instead of cobalt if you can. And Tesla is clearly seeing that and trying to go in that direction.
But you've also got a fair proportion of nickel being produced in Russia as well, and we don't know.
Yes, that's another big question. Russia, particularly one company, Norilsk Nickel, produces about 20% of global supply of class 1 nickel. That's the type of nickel which is traded on the LME, and that's the type of nickel which is needed for those high nickel battery chemistries. So for now, Norilsk Nickel is not on the sanction list. It's functioning normally. But obviously there is a geopolitical risk that something could happen to this supply. And another aspect of high nickel use is its volatility of its price. We had this scare earlier this year where nickel prices temporarily went to $100,000 per ton, which was 500% within a few days. The LME suspended nickel trading because of that and canceled all those contracts at those very high prices. So it came down now to about $28,000 per ton, which is still high compared to, say, $12,000, which we had about a year ago or so. If nickel becomes too expensive, battery makers may think again, whether it's a good idea to put 90% nickel into a cathode of the battery. And they may be looking for replacements which are not using nickel. And such a replacement exists, and it's called the LFP, lithium iron phosphate battery. And these were around for quite a long time, but were being looked unfavorably because they have a relatively low energy density and are only good for vehicles with limited range and so on and so forth. But since then, several things happened, which is improvements in general production of LFP batteries. By using coating of crystals of the cathode with carbon nanotubes and other things like that, the engineers were able to improve and increase their energy density. So the generation 2 LFP batteries are much better than the original ones. And now, guess what? They think of using manganese in them. Over the last 3 or 4 months, we had some news, mostly from China, but China is not the only country where this is happening, where battery makers are experimenting with adding manganese to the LFP chemistry to increase their energy density by something between 15 and 20%. So when you take it apart and technical details of how it could be done start emerging gradually, it turns out that it's not just a sprinkling of manganese added to some other battery technology, what is known in the industry as doping, but a significant replacement. So what would happen in LFP batteries? Between 50 and 60% of iron used in this cathode will be replaced with manganese. And for those who are curious, I'm sending you to the periodic table, and you will see that manganese is sitting very close to iron. So replacing, from the purely chemical point of view, replacing iron with manganese is a relatively straightforward business. We here at CPM Group, we did some calculations based on those early leaks from China, and the analysis of the patents for these new LMFP batteries. And we came to the conclusion that if all LFPs, which are forecast to be produced by 2031, if all of them were replaced with LMFPs, this would boost the already high demand for manganese sulphate by, listen to that, 70%. Massive. Not all of them will be replaced and so on. But it's still, we are talking about serious double-digit increase in manganese demand as a result of using manganese in LFP batteries, which until now we believed are not manganese batteries. And now they are becoming ones.
What's the forecast looking like for EV? I think last year we saw was around 6.4 million EVs injected into the market.
Indeed, we saw over 100% increase between 2020 and 21, which is a very good result for the EV industry. The pace of adoption is not slowing down despite COVID, despite the war, despite the looming recession, despite the increase in the cost of battery materials. This doesn't somehow translate into reduction in demand. But there may be a slowdown at some point. In 2021, for the first time ever, we saw the cost per kilowatt of battery, cost of production per 1 kilowatt of battery, going up rather than going down. That was as a result of higher prices of battery metals. But essentially the electric vehicle revolution is doing well. And I think the fact that now manganese is going to be also used for LFP batteries, which were like the main competitor for NMC chemistry, which is the biggest consumer of manganese, that's very good news for this metal.
So at the moment, obviously, just want to make things clear as well. So there's effectively more than one market here for manganese, and it's all down to the end product, right? Because manganese that we were talking about earlier that goes in steel is really completely divorced now from manganese sulphate, or high purity sulphate,
yes,
which is now in batteries.
Even more than that, because when you talk about manganese sulphate, we have two varieties of this product. One is the agricultural variety, which goes into fertilizers, goes into as a supplement for cattle feed, goes into fungicides and so on. And this material is relatively cheap and doesn't have to be very pure. And then we have the high purity manganese sulphate, which is required for the batteries. And this is, if you like, a pharmacy grade material. And I'm often asked the question, why the new entrants to the market for this material, for high purity manganese sulphate, are not the agri-producers of this material. And my answer to it is because it's very difficult to make the transition from being an agricultural grade producer to a high grade, pharmacy grade, if you like, a battery grade purity sulphate. So the pipeline of the project for this material hasn't changed since we last spoke in September. It's just 5 projects which are not in China. we still don't see all the demand being satisfied, even without the additional demand from LFPs. There is, however, some news from China. There is one big Chinese producer who just announced the start of construction of the sulfate plant, and with a very significant capacity of several 100,000 tons of the material. That created some panic among the aspiring Western producers, but this panic was short-lived because the deficit is so significant that this addition of this new injection from China is actually a positive factor. If we allow the deficits to grow too big, the battery makers will get scared that their needs may not be satisfied, and they will start searching for alternatives.
Well, it's similar to cobalt in a way, isn't it? If a lot of the manufacturers are worried that potentially supply side may be affected eventually, and therefore that's why they've moved away from it.
Indeed. So ideally, from the point of view of the manganese, high purity manganese producer, you want a deficit to be high enough to put pressure on the prices to go up, but not big enough to discourage battery engineers from using this product.
It sounds as though that isn't happening in a way, because I think when we spoke before, there's 300 years of mine life out there of manganese, but it's actually converting that into obviously the high purity.
The conversion is the problem.
Yeah.
There is not enough conversion, and the conversion capacity there is, 92% of it is in China.
Right. And what's the pipeline looking like? I know we did touch on this in the last video, and obviously recommend people go and watch that if they haven't already, because there's a lot more information in there. But what's the pipeline in terms of, you're talking about these 5 other companies, are they all high purity?
Yes, there are 5 non-Chinese companies currently developing projects. Strangely enough, they are all at a similar stage, which is a feasibility study stage, and they are all planning to build, or in the very near future, planning to build demonstration plants, which will allow them to produce several hundred kilos of samples, which is the minimum required by the OEMs to start testing their new suppliers. So we expect this crop to come to fruition, to production in 2025, possibly 26, 27. That's more realistic in my view, when they are all converging on the market. But by then, the demand will have moved upwards again. So even though their launch day of start of production is very welcome, but it's far from meeting the demand though in those days.
Surely even by that point, if, say for example, the LFP batteries do start incorporating a lot more manganese, we've already got the NMC batteries, which obviously require a fair bit anyway. Even with that injection of 5 new projects coming online in, say, 2025, 2027, is that enough?
It's not enough, but so our view definitely breaks down into 2 periods, before 2030 or 31 and after that. Beyond 2030, we don't see any more projects having a realistic chance of going into production, because if there were any new projects, we would have known about them. They should have been at the similar stage to the projects which I mentioned. Beyond 2031, we'll probably see more projects, just what I call coming out of the woodwork, because people will be very much seeing the opportunity, and the market should start responding by building more capacity. But before 2030, I don't see any more than the 5 projects which I mentioned. There will be some expansions in China, but the 2021 results of Chinese production, I wouldn't say that was disappointing, but it wasn't as high as expected. It was lower than expectations. They grew by about 90%.
And just to actually just finish things off, you mentioned a stockpile earlier. How large is that stockpile? And I assume that's not high purity.
No, that's the stockpile is the metallurgical stockpile.
Right. So there's no stockpiles of high purity manganese.
But maybe there are some stocks at the producers' sites, but they are not published, so I can't give you the number.
Fine. But in general, though, the whole theme of this in general seems. Well, it depends if you're a battery manufacturer, or a miner. But if you're a mining company looking to enter this space, or you're an investor with exposure to this space, It seems pretty positive though.
It does. I mean, again, I will be very sort of have bifocal view of this. So ordinary manganese for steel applications, it's at the mercy of the steel market.
Yeah.
And this steel market, the jury is still out, whether it's flatlining, is it falling, or will it be growing because of this reconstruction of the Ukraine and other factors I mentioned. So we are uncertain, how it's going to play up, and particularly if we have a recession between now and say 2025 or 26. For this high purity manganese, which goes into batteries, we are much more certain, if this is the right word, that this demand will remain strong, and then there isn't enough capacity. So we will probably see a continuous divergence of the prices of the metallurgical product and the chemical product for the batteries.
Just to, I guess, finish things off, do you publish any research on this, or how can people find out a bit more? Because I know you've got a pretty extensive research arm that does look at this metal in particular.
That's our niche we are very proud of. I think we have one of the best research departments regarding high purity manganese, particularly the ones used in batteries. We do not publish off-the-shelf reports, but we tailor-made every report to our customers' needs. Some customers are more advanced, some have mines, others don't have mines, but just do the processing. So we tailor-made each of our reports to their needs. And if you go to our website, cpmgroup.com, you will find more about it.
Perfect. All right. Well, recommend anyone to do that. But for the meantime, thank you for coming back, and hopefully in another 8 months or less, see what happens in the market, but we'll have another catch up and see how it's going on.
Thank you very much for having me, and I encourage everybody who watched this video to get more interested in manganese. That's the unsung hero of the batteries industry, and you'll hear about it more and more.